An inch. Stand at the edge of Lake Mead right now, and that's roughly what separates the intake pipe still feeding Las Vegas's drinking water from becoming the second one this decade to break the surface and go completely useless. The first one already did, back in 2022. Nobody expected the second to be this close behind it. Here's a number worth sitting with before anything else. 90%. That's roughly how much of Las Vegas's drinking water comes from this one lake. Not a backup supply, not one option among several. The primary source for a metro area of 2.3 million people sitting in one of the driest deserts in North America. So when people ask what actually happens if Lake Mead keeps dropping, the honest answer isn't a hypothetical disaster movie scenario. It's a plumbing problem happening in slow motion that the city has already been racing against for over a decade. If you've ever actually stood on the shore here, the scale of that slow motion is hard to fully process from a photo. The pale mineral ring wrapping the canyon walls climbs well over 100 feet above the current waterline in places. A permanent bathtub stain marking exactly how much the lake has already lost. Marinas built decades ago at what used to be the shoreline now sit stranded hundreds of yards from open water, forcing relocation after relocation as the lake keeps retreating from infrastructure that was never designed to chase it. Let's talk about the straws, because that's genuinely what water engineers call them. Intake number 1, built in 1971, sat at roughly 1,050 feet of elevation and delivered water to Las Vegas for over 50 years. In April of 2022, the lake dropped below that line, and intake number 1 simply stopped working. Not damaged, not reduced. Done permanently the moment the water surface fell below it. That left intake number 2, built in 2000 at around 1,000 feet, still functioning but with less margin every single year. And here's where the story usually gets summarized as more dramatic than it actually is right now. Las Vegas didn't just cross its fingers and hope intake 2 would hold forever. Starting in 2008, the Southern Nevada Water Authority spent nearly 7 years drilling something called the third straw, a 3-mile tunnel bored directly through solid rock beneath the floor of Lake Mead, connecting to an intake sitting at roughly 860 feet, deep enough to keep pulling water even if the lake fell all the way to dead pool. Cost: $817 million. A second facility, the Low Lake Level Pumping Station, came online in 2020, adding pumping capacity down to 875 feet, for another $522 million. Total price tag for keeping Las Vegas's taps running no matter how far this lake falls. Somewhere north of $1.5 billion. Now here's the question worth actually asking. If the city already spent that kind of money solving the water access problem, why does one more inch of decline still matter at all? Because access was never the whole problem. It solved whether the water can reach the pumps. It didn't solve where enough water comes from in the first place, and it didn't touch the second, much less talked about crisis sitting right behind it. Power. Every inch Lake Mead drops also drops the pressure driving Hoover Dam's turbines, the machines producing a meaningful share of the electricity that keeps those same water pumps, treatment plants, and air conditioners running across the whole region. 12 of the dam's 17 original turbines already sit idle, retired below a pressure threshold where running them would tear the blades apart from the inside. You can build all the tunnels you want to reach the water. If the power grid pulling that water uphill to homes and businesses is straining at the same time, the fix on one side doesn't cancel out the problem building on the other. So who's actually pulling this lake down? This is where a lot of viewers watching this exact story have their own theory, and it's worth addressing directly instead of dancing around it. Is this about AI data centers? Short answer, not primarily, at least not yet, but the concern isn't baseless either. Nevada has seen a real documented surge in data center construction and proposals over the past few years, and those facilities do use water, both directly for cooling and indirectly through the electricity they draw from the same strained grid Hoover Dam feeds. Some of that demand is real and growing. But measured against the total draw on this river system, agriculture still dwarfs it by an enormous margin. Roughly 70% of all Colorado River water gets used for farming, much of it for water-intensive crops like alfalfa, grown largely to feed cattle, with a significant share of that specific crop actually exported overseas. Urban use, including every home, business, and yes, every data center across the entire basin, makes up a much smaller slice of the total. That doesn't mean data centers are irrelevant to watch. It means the loudest villain in this story isn't the one people online are usually pointing at first. And if you're the kind of person already thinking there's an obvious big fix nobody's trying, you're not wrong to wonder. Desalination gets brought up constantly, and for good reason on paper. An ocean sitting right there with technology that already exists to remove the salt. The problem isn't whether it's possible, it's that the nearest ocean water sits hundreds of miles from Lake Mead, separated by mountain ranges, meaning any desalinated water would need to be pumped uphill across enormous distances at a cost that dwarfs almost every other option on the table. A pipeline from the Great Lakes gets floated just as often, and it's been seriously studied more than once. It keeps getting shelved for the same reason. Moving that much water across that much terrain runs into the tens of billions of dollars, plus a legal fight with every state and Canadian province that also has a claim on those lakes. These aren't stupid ideas. They're expensive ones, competing against cheaper, faster fixes that governments keep choosing instead, for better or worse. Which brings us back to the inch. Right now, that's roughly the distance between the current water level and the threshold that would push intake number 2 permanently out of service, leaving the entire city dependent on the 2 newer, deeper systems built specifically for this scenario. Cross that line, and Las Vegas doesn't run dry. The engineering built over the last 15 years should, on paper, keep water reaching the city even at historically low lake levels. But every fallback the city builds costs real money that eventually shows up on water bills, and every inch lost narrows the margin for the next unexpected dry year on top of this one. Here's the part worth being straight about, because plenty of people watching stories like this one are rightly tired of pure alarm dressed up as news. Las Vegas has actually done something genuinely impressive here that rarely gets credit. Per-person water use in the city has dropped by more than half since 2002, even as the population grew by hundreds of thousands of people. Decorative grass has been banned outright in new developments and physically ripped out elsewhere, with homeowners and businesses paid directly to replace it with desert landscaping. Ornamental water features, the kind of decorative fountains and pools that once defined Las Vegas's aesthetic, are now heavily restricted in new construction. The city recycles roughly 85% of the water used indoors, treating it and returning it straight back to the lake, the highest recycling rate of any state in the entire Colorado River basin. This isn't a city sitting passively watching the water disappear. It's one of the most aggressive conservation programs anywhere in the country, and it's part of why the crisis hasn't already turned into the emergency. Some headlines make it sound like today, but conservation and engineering can only stretch a fixed supply so far when the underlying math hasn't changed. This river was divided up in 1922 based on flow measurements taken during one of the wettest stretches in over 1,000 years of recorded history. And every state's share was calculated against a number the river has rarely matched since. Farms, cities, and tribal nations across 7 states are all drawing from a promise larger than what the river actually carries most years. And Las Vegas's $1.5 billion plumbing fix, however impressive, doesn't touch that deeper imbalance at all. So what's the honest takeaway here? Not that Las Vegas is about to go dry. The infrastructure built specifically to prevent that has, so far, worked. What's actually true is narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. A city spent $1.5 billion solving the problem of physically reaching falling water, while the reason that water keeps falling in the first place remains completely unsolved, sitting one negotiation, one dry winter, 1 inch at a time, exactly where it's been for over 2 decades. If you want to see whether this year's snowpack buys the lake any real breathing room, or whether that inch disappears before winter even arrives, subscribe because this story updates every time the number does.